today we are talking about King Herod. I have a fascination with what makes people tick, with what makes people, you know, be the way they are, especially when it comes to leaders, right? Are these leaders who are crazy or good? Is it because of who they are? Is it because of the situation? You know, when we look at our leaders today in the modern times, is this something that we can, you know, use again to teach ourselves, or are these things that only happen because they happen? And Herod the Great is one of these examples of, on the one hand, someone who is really amazing, on the other hand, someone who is absolutely nuts. And how do we judge this, you know, today and in the future, and how do we rate leaders in the same way? So before we really get started, we have to go back in history, because nothing happens in a bubble. Herod didn't, you know, get dropped off on a doorstep with no backing. He was who he was because of his past. So I'm going to go back in history, back to the 300s BCE, to Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great is conquering from Macedonia, right, from northern Greece. And he is conquering what the whole known world, right? His whole world, Europe, Asia, North Africa. He is this crazy commander. And he conquers the area of Judea. Now, Alexander the Great had this brilliant idea. He said, I'm going to be different. I'm not going to conquer someone and make them do what I want. I'm going to see what's best about their cultures, and I'm going to incorporate it into my own culture, right? We're going to mix cultures a little bit. So here's the thing, Alexander the Great, as a Hellenist, right, as this early Greek culture, his culture and the Jewish culture, both at the time and today, butted heads a lot. They weren't the same, right? If we think about Greek culture and you think of, you know, Alexander the Great and the Olympics and Socrates and everything, what would you sum up? 1, 2, 3 things. What are the key things you think about when you think about Greek culture? You can type, or you can unmute yourself for a second. What do they love?
I believe there was an emphasis on the body and on physical beauty, physical strength.
Okay, good. Exactly, right? It's about you think about the statues, right? You know, the chiseled statues, right? You think about the sports, the naked wrestling. Okay, very much about the body. What else?
Hello. Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Tendency toward democracy.
Okay, good. Democracy, right? Someone here on the side said theater. Okay, so it's about, you know, show. It's about perfection. It's about being godlike, right? And if we have to sum up Jewish belief, right? What is most important today, back then, to Jewish culture? If you had to say this is, you know, key points of Jewish culture, what's important to us? Yeah, Beatrice, or not Beatrice, but
education.
Okay, education. I see a hand, but I can't. Maybe I can unmute you. I don't know if I can unmute you. There, try now.
I think the concept of tzedakah and helping others.
Polytheism and monotheism.
Okay, so the concept of helping others, monotheism, good, monotheism versus polytheism. You know, yeah, the Judaism is about, you know, monotheism. So God, we can't be God, right? We can't be perfect. That's not a thing in Judaism. And I've talked about that before when I talked about King David, right? You know, this desire to be great, but understanding that humanity isn't perfect. Unlike the Greeks who believe that you could get perfect, right? About helping others, if you think about the concept of modesty, right? No, you know, good self-Jew would walk around, do naked wrestling, right? That's not an ideal. Or make fancy statues, right? That's not part of our culture. So these things were very much at odds with each other, even though Alexander the Great tried to bring them together. So he conquers this area. He does really well. He says, you know, Jews, I want to help you. And then he dies, very young. He dies, he's in his 30s. And after he dies, this area is sent into war from 2 of his generals. One is the Seleucid Empire, who takes over the kind of Lebanon, Syria area, and the Ptolemies, who take over Egypt. And we're right in the middle. So we get all the fighting in between. Everyone wants this land as a land bridge. Now, it goes back and forth. We end up under the Seleucids, we end up under the Ptolemies, but the whole time Greek culture is being pushed upon us. And this time they don't like the Jews, right? They want Greek culture. This is the best. We want to make Greek temples, right? We want to pray to Zeus. This is the key thing. This leads us up to the time of the Maccabees. I know I'm going really quickly through history, but it's important, I promise. So we get to the Maccabees, right, to Hanukkah, and the Jews fight back. They say, that's it. We don't want to live underneath the rule of the Greeks anymore, right? We want to have our own Jewish country to rule ourselves, not this clash of cultures. We want to have our great temple. We want to pray to our own God, and we want to have our own culture. And surprise, surprise, if you know the story of Hanukkah, we win. This is a great thing, right? It's the underdog. It's David versus Goliath. We've beaten this great, great army, this great nation. What do you do next? What's our first goal? What was the goal of the Maccabees? What do you think they want more than anything?
Build a temple.
Okay, good. To build a temple, right? We're going to rebuild our own temple. And then we're going to build a Jewish state, right? A nation, a country, a Jewish country. And that's really great. And we build a Jewish state and we get our first leader. And here comes the very first question. New Jewish state, what do we call our leader? Well, what is he? What would you call him? His name's Simon. You have to unmute. Can you guys unmute yourselves or no? All right. Lynn, I think you're trying. Try now, Lynn. No. Sorry, I can't hear you. You can type in the chat box if you know. Okay, so Susie says king. What's the problem with the title of king? And I talked about this back with King David. Can you guys not unmute yourselves? Is this just a general problem that we're having here?
They're not from the tribe of Judah. They're not, these are the priestly class. They're from the tribe of Levi, and they're not from the tribe of Judah, which is where kings came from.
Good. So we don't want a king, right? We're not the right class. Also, a king is very much like what the Greeks had, right? This, superior image. We don't really want that. So Simon, the very first, he names himself high priest and then prince, right? Those are our terms in the C, right? Its term doesn't exactly, it means prince, but not exactly prince, right? That we are not a king. That's great. Nice Jewish country. Guess what his son calls himself? King. Right? By then, he wants to be recognized by the new ruling power in town, and that's the Romans, and he wants to be a king. He wants to show the world that we are as good as anybody else. So he names himself king. Now, we have these series of rulers, right? We have Simon, right? Shimon, which is, a nice, strong Jewish name. And his son, we already start beginning to see the influences of Greek and Romans coming in. We have John Hyrcanus, right? Kind of a nice, strong Greek name. And John Hyrcanus wants to be king and show the world that he is king. So one of the first things he does is he roams into Edom, which is just on the side of Judea, and he force converts the Idumeans. Now, I hope you all know, Judaism doesn't believe in forced conversion. That's not a thing we do, right? Conversion needs to come of yourself. And we talked about conversion with the story of Ruth. But he force converts them or kills them. So he's converted this thing. He's turned Judaism into this, kind of war religion. We've proven ourselves on this international stage. And he names, again, these names are important. He names his son Aristobulus, Hyrcanus, right? These Greek names. We can clearly see that we're kind of losing the strong Maccabee idea of a Jewish state, right? We want to be now a modern state, and those are two different things. And as the years go on, this fight between Judaism and being, Greek, Roman, this culture, it's hard. And so these rulers begin a civil war between who's going to rule, right? We have Aristobulus, we have Hyrcanus. They get into the civil war over who's going to rule. Now, we have this other man whose name is Antipater. And Antipater is an Idumean. It means he's a forced convert. And he loves the Romans. He thinks Roman culture is the best. This is the new way for the future. And so he turns to Pompey and Julius Caesar, and he says, there's a civil war going on in Judea. Why don't you guys come in and check it out and see if you can help us? Pompey and Julius Caesar go to check it out, see a civil war, see this great new land, and immediately join in and take it for themselves. They join in the fight. And when they leave this area of Judea, because there's a lot of stuff going on in Rome, they can't focus all their effort here. They want to put someone in power who is basically a puppet king, right? Someone who is a king, but who understands that in the end, Rome is in charge. And so they choose Herod. Now, Herod just happens to be, fun fact, Antipater's son, right? So no surprise there, it's all connected. But Herod was raised in Roman culture. He studied in Roman education. He had a very classical education, and he was very Roman in his actions, although he'd been raised Jewish. So on the one hand, he is Jewish. On the other hand, he's very Roman. Now, Herod's already married by that point. He has a wife whose name is Doris, and that doesn't work for him because what he needs is a legitimacy to his rule. So he immediately sends his wife away with his son, and he marries the granddaughter of the people who'd been fighting before, Miriam in Hebrew, because that gives him legitimacy, right? The line to the throne. So he marries her, and he settles into his new role as king. Now, he has this image, this dream for Judea. He wants to create this new land that's going to rival the best of the best. Okay, so he begins to plan. Now I'm going to share a couple pictures. So I hope you all can see that. Okay, so the first thing he begins to do, if you're going to be Herod the Great, right? You want to create this legacy, this image, this future, and you want to prove yourself as a Jew, because remember, he's the son of an Idumean, so he's a forced convert, or his father was. So a lot of people don't see him as being a true Jew, right? Really understanding what it means to be Jewish. So the first thing he wants to do is assure the people that he is really Jewish. So he begins to build this structure, or at least the outer walls of this structure. This is the cave of the patriarchs in Hebron, supposedly where our fathers and mothers were buried. And again, it's a sign that he is focusing on religious matters. He's rebuilding this great religious state. He's allowing people to come to a religious site. So that's kind of the first thing he does, right? Look, we are great, we're Jewish. Then, I haven't mentioned it yet, we'll get to it later. He's very paranoid, and he likes having castles all around that he can go and hide in case anything happens. And so he turns to Masada. Now, maybe a lot of you have been to Masada before. Masada is out by the Dead Sea. Masada had already been built upon by people before him, by Aristobulus and by Hyrcanus before him, but it wasn't any sort of great monument. It simply had a few guards, and that was about it. So he goes to this mountain. It is a steep, steep cliff. It's in the middle of nowhere. The only way up is this little tiny winding path. There's no way to get an army up there. And he begins to build. Now, I don't know about you. I'm not an engineer. My parents are engineers. If I looked at this flat mountaintop, I would not see anything. But Herod looks at it and he sees palaces and baths. And on the right-hand side here, you can see he actually builds the northern palace down the slope of the cliff, right? He builds it into the side of the cliff. Now you can imagine the poor slaves were to carry all the stuff, right, up the mountain, up this little snake path, and then down the side of the mountain. But he builds a great throne room, right? And he builds a great bath, and he builds actually 2 palaces up on top of the mountain, because when you're Herod, why not? And he builds everything you could want on top of this mountain. And back then, of course, if you look at the picture on the left, the Dead Sea was much higher then, right? So it was basically a seaside resort. You could sit on the edge of the cliff and look out over the water. So he builds this great thing. He puts this Roman bath in as a sign. Now, there's a couple important things to notice for those of us who are architecture nerds here. The bottom right, this is part of the bathhouse. The Romans were very particular about bathhouses. It wasn't just to have a bath, to be clean. It was about sharing business, right? It was a place to share philosophy. It was a place to talk business. And there was you'd work out, you'd go into the cold room, into the warm room, into the hot room, into the sauna. And it was very much a part of Roman life. And so he builds one on top of Masada. It's a lot of effort. And he builds mosaics, right? He wants these beautiful floors. He wants to show everyone how wealthy he is and how smart he is. You can notice, or you should pay attention to, that none of the mosaics Herod uses have figures in them. There's no people, there's no animals, and this is a nod to Judaism, right? We don't put graven images and things. And so he's showing the people that he has respect for Judaism, right? He's not just building this great Roman bathhouse, but he's also going to build in a way that respects, at least somewhat, Jewish culture, right? So he's balancing these two sides. His greatest economic achievement, and the thing that really changes the face of Israel or Judea, is Caesarea. Now, if you've never been to Caesarea, I hope you get the chance to go one day. The left is an artist's rendition of what the port looked like in the time of the Romans, and then what it looks like today. Now, Israel is, right on the chunk of land that connects Africa and Asia and Europe. It's a great area for trade. It doesn't have a lot of great ports. That's a really big issue. And so Herod looks around and says, I'm going to build a deep water port. I'm going to build breakers. I'm going to sink things out in the ocean. He's got this new hydraulic concrete. He's going to build his own harbor. And this is insane. At the time it was built, it was the largest man-made harbor in existence. This is, the scale of technology that was used was all brand new at the time. He brought in all these things from Italy, this new concrete from Italy. At least 44 boatloads of this material had to be brought in from Italy in order to build the harbor. And as you can see, it's not just the harbor, but everything that goes with the harbor, right? All the economic businesses. And then of course, he's Roman, right? So he also wants to build things like a hippodrome and a Colosseum. So here you can see an image of, you can kind of see in the left, the dark areas are what's left of the harbor, right? And then what it would have looked like originally. So it really stretched well out into the Mediterranean. And if anyone is a diver, it's actually really cool. You can dive out. There's an underwater archaeological park that you can dive out into today to see what's going on in the port of Caesarea. This is the hippodrome. A hippodrome is a racing, it's for horse racing, right? When it was built, this could hold 15,000, 20,000 people, which was a huge number, especially for an area of Judea, which is a backwater town. Right, you can see it right along the edges of the water, right, with a beautiful view. And this was very important. Someone asked, Larry asked, how many deepwater ports existed in Israel at the time of Herod? Basically, there was one other, but this was the safest once it was built. This was the only basically deepwater port they used at the time. Basically one other one down in the south, but there were issues also with other foreign countries there. So he builds these great theaters, right? The Hippodrome, I said, seats about 20,000. He builds an amphitheater that holds originally around 8,000 people. It was then expanded later on to about 15,000 people. So again, he builds these great centers. This, funnily enough, was actually his palace. The water level has obviously changed. I'll talk about in a second why it doesn't exist anymore, but this was the area of the palace right on the edge of the water. Oh, sorry. So it's this great thing, right? So what happens? There's a couple issues. First is that he didn't know it. If anyone knows anything about Israel, we exist on a fault line. We have earthquakes. Not quite as common as I'm used to in San Francisco, but they're still rather common. So sometime around the 1st century CE, there was an earthquake and a tsunami that damaged the harbor significantly. We're not exactly sure when it stopped being in use, but it lasted about 200 years and then it kind of fell apart. But still, in the time it was in use, it became a center of Judea. When the Romans really came in the time of the procurators, after about 6 CE, they made Caesarea their capital, right? This was the economic capital. This was the military capital. If you know anything about Christianity, this is where Pontius Pilate sat in his seat of government. So Caesarea really became a center of Judea, right? A brand new face of Judea. Now, perhaps his most famous building, of course, is what is today the Temple Mount. Herod, looks at the Second Temple. It's kind of a dinky little building. And he's trying to prove himself, right? He wants to show the Jews that he appreciates them. So he wants to expand the mountain. Now, the problem is it's a mountain. It has a little tiny peak with a little tiny area to build a temple. So he says, well, forget the mountain. What I'm going to do is I'm going to extend the mountain. I'm going to make the mountain bigger. And so he basically, anyone who I have a couple students here, we've done this before. If you hold your hands out, right, and make kind of a square. He basically built a square, not a full square, because there was part of a mountain there, around the mountain, and he filled it in with dirt. And he raised the floor level of the old city, what's today the old city. When you stand at like the Western Wall, right, that's not the level that the mountain was at before Herod, right? That's all fake dirt filled in below you. You kind of see it here below. And then he carved it kind of into the mountain. So he raised a platform, right, very, very tall, and built a huge new temple on top of it. Now, again, there were some crazy feats of engineering here. You can't see it so well in the top picture here, but there are huge pieces of rock. I mean, even these small pieces of rock weigh 20 tons, 23 tons. I don't know if that means anything to anybody, but they weigh a lot. The largest stone is 45 feet by 11 feet. I mean, if you could just think about how big that is and then how they moved it. There's all sorts of historians who've analyzed the quarry was uphill, so they might have rolled it down on wooden logs, or they have a pulley system. Honestly, I come back to it every time. It's got to be aliens. It's all I can figure out, because these things are massive, massive pieces of stone. That was a joke. I don't know if anybody laughed, but okay. So he builds these big, big pieces of stone because he wanted it to look one piece. He didn't want it to look haphazard. He didn't want it to look like a wall, right? Like little tiny stones in a wall. He wanted it to look grand. He also was aware that at this time, right, we're still in BCE, that no one had ever seen a building this large. And if anyone's ever been to New York or around skyscrapers, there's kind of this sense when you walk into a big city and you look up that everything's going to fall on you, right? Like, how are these buildings standing up? And so he actually built the temple, or the wall of the temple. It actually kind of curves in so that it doesn't look like it's falling, right? It's all about eyesight, right? So that it looks like it's a straight building, versus if it were actually a straight building, it would feel like it was falling on you. If you've ever been to, in Athens, if you've ever been to Parthenon, the same kind of, they built the other way, right? They built out so it looks like it's kind of expanding. So he built this great retaining wall and this great platform. And on top of it, he built a great temple. And this was the talk of the town, right? Again, he's built this huge platform, football fields high, and you can see it now from all around because it's an artificial top to a mountain, right? So any mountain you're on, if you've been to Jerusalem, if you're on the Mount of Olives or any mountain around it, you can see the top of what would have been the Holy Temple. And that was really important for Herod, right? That everyone's going to see this. We still have pieces of it. Of course, it was destroyed by the Romans later on. But if you've been in the Davidson Center, or if you've been in part of the Western Wall, we do have, proof of what stood above this temple. Although what exactly it looks like, we only know from recordings. I'm going to stop sharing 1 second. So, if we're talking about all these great things that Herod built, we kind of like the guy. Right? I mean, he changed the face of Judea. He created an economic center. He created a center for trade. He did a bunch of great religious things, right? He built a holy temple. He built the Cave of the Patriarchs. Plus, he built all these other palaces, these centers, these cities, Herodium that popped up, right? He built these great things and made Judea kind of a happening place to be. The problem was, beyond that, he wasn't always so great. So I said before, he marries Miriam to make his connection to the old regime, and he makes her brother the high priest. right? That's his act of goodwill. Look, I'm keeping the family, in power. I'm following along. Just a year later, he gets very worried that his brother-in-law is more liked than he is, so he has him drowned very publicly, very ugly. And that's just step one. From everything he does after that, he is hyper paranoid. He believes only about 4 years later that his wife is cheating on him. And so he accuses her, and then he puts her on trial, and then he threatens to kill his mother-in-law. And his mother-in-law is so freaked out that she actually throws her daughter under the bus and says, kill her. She was the one trying to kill you. So he kills his wife. He is so upset because he loved her so much that he embalms her in a vat of honey and keeps her next to his bed. There's all sorts of dad jokes that we like to tell about, hey, honey, I'm home kind of stuff. But he keeps her next to his bed. There's actually a term in the Talmud where it talks about Herod's unspeakable deeds that stem from this idea that he kept her body next to him for years. But it's kind of this psychosis we see already, right? That he has this extreme paranoia, but also this, I loved her so much, I have to keep her body next to me forever, right? So he kills his wife, and then he remarries a different Miriam, not actually related. And by now he's got a bunch of kids. He's got 4 sons, a couple daughters, and his sons are getting older, and he begins to worry that his sons are going to overthrow him. So he puts his sons on trial, and he has his sons killed, his 2 middle sons, the ones from Miriam, right? Because she had threatened him, and therefore his sons must have gotten this from her. And then he brings in his eldest son from the first marriage, who he's already banished, and says, you need to come back. And then he feels threatened by him, so he has him killed. And he goes through this series where anyone who looks at him wrong, including family, gets killed, drowned, gets their head cut off. There is a phrase that they say that it's better to be King Herod's pig than his son. This idea that he kept Judaism, right? He wouldn't eat a pig, but if you were his son, you were more likely to get your head chopped off. Beyond the fact that he's killing people left and right, it's amazing that he's building these great things, but what does it mean to build great things? What do you need to build great things? You need money. And where does money come from? It comes from taxes. So he is taxing like crazy. He is stealing money left, right, and center, and he's building these great things. And on the one hand, we want a great second temple, right? That's fine, but do we really need another castle at Masada and another palace at Herodium and all these things? And at some point, how great is the second temple? Do we really need it bigger and bigger and bigger and better, right? At what point have you gone overboard? And he is taxing like crazy. So he's taxing like crazy. He's killing people. If anyone, again, is into Christianity, there's also a story that when he heard that Jesus would be a firstborn son, right, that would come and overthrow him, that he massacred children. Probably not true, probably actually relating to him killing his own sons and the other massacres he went on. He killed high priests and this kind of thing. But Josephus, who talks about it, Josephus is a Roman writer, a Jewish Roman writer, a historian at the time. He gives Herod the benefit of the doubt, but also kind of says it could have happened because that's what Herod was like. Like, that's how bad he was. Probably didn't, but who knows? So he's doing these terrible things. He's going crazy. Some of this might have to do with what happens at the very end. Now, he has his eldest child killed only a couple weeks before he dies himself. And at the very end, it is very clear that he is very, very sick. If you don't like Herod, maybe you see this as a sign of justice, because his death is terrible and gory and super, super painful. They don't really know what it was. It was probably some sort of STD, probably some sort of gonorrhea that went bad. There is a very nice description of it. If anyone would like to close your ears if this isn't something that you like to hear. But Josephus, again, the historian, writes that the pain of his illness led him to suicide. He had intense itching, painful intestinal problems, breathlessness, convulsions in every limb, and gangrene of the genitals. So things are bad. And he tries to commit suicide. He's stopped. They actually decide, again, medicine wasn't the best at the time, and they're trying to balance out what they called his four humors. They decided the best thing to do would be to put him in a vat of boiling oil. I don't know how you would feel being stuck in a vat of boiling oil. It actually made him blind for a period. That's how bad it was. But that's how bad his pain was. Anything would go. He definitely suffered at the end. Whether this paranoia from before is all connected or whether it's separate, we of course don't really know. But I think it's all well summed up in the fact that before Herod dies, in his will, he makes a very specific point to say that when he dies, he wants all of the key noblemen in the country to be murdered. Every last one of them. Why? Because he's afraid that when he dies, they're going to celebrate. He doesn't want anybody celebrating his death, so he insists that they get murdered. Probably for better. Once he does die, his son who succeeds him doesn't follow his plan and doesn't murder all these high-ranking nobles, which probably is a good thing in the end. But again, this extreme paranoia. So that's kind of the story of Herod the Great. And I think it's on one hand, how do we look at our rulers and say, on the one hand, Herod changed Judea for the better, right? There's no doubt, right? In the ancient world, he moved Judea up on the map into a modern world, into a modern country, right? Put it on the map as far as trade, as far as visiting, as far as just the look, coming to visit. We have these pilgrimages. This was the place to be. I mean, even today, I sometimes wonder if we didn't have Herod the Great, what would tourism look like in Israel today, right? I mean, all of our top tourist places, Masada, Caesarea, right? Herodium's an up and coming thing. If you look at, the whole underneath the second temple, this is all Herod. So he really did great things for Judea. On the other hand, he killed hundreds of people, perhaps thousands of people unnecessarily. He killed his own family, and he played the line between what it means to be a Roman and what it means to be a Jew. Now, I think it's also important to note that after Herod dies, his son comes into power. There's a bit of a civil war after, but there's no other king of Judah. Right? And once Herod dies, we head into the civil war. The Romans finally come in and say, that's it, right? We're not putting up with you guys anymore. The Roman procurators take over, and then we head into, everything else, into Romans, Crusades, everything else up into modern day. But Herod managed to somehow hold that balance between having a Jewish state and existing under the Romans, which isn't a small feat, right? Anyone who would have had a real Jewish state wouldn't have been able to exist under Roman because they wanted, themselves to be the best of the best. And you can see in his own rules, he stopped them from making sacrifices of pigs and stuff in the Holy Temple. He refused to put, an eagle on top of the temple. He very much clearly wanted to have a Jewish, maybe minimum line, but a Jewish line. And that's why I find him so fascinating, right? Is how do we balance this good and this bad?